us there. So I want to dig a little bit into kind of getting our minds thinking about the future. I love this general topic around, I call this this idea about being a future thinking leader as what I would consider a bit of an advanced skill for most leaders, because I think we're all pretty good at being able to assess what's going on around us, dealing with the urgent, kind of the here and the now, and keeping our teams on task to move them forward to a very specific set of goals. But what happens when everything kind of goes crazy, like what we're living in right now, where you can't really tell what's happening and things seem very unclear to you, and all of a sudden everything that you thought you knew and could plan for around the future goes away and gets changed? That's when you have to really get good at developing your own future thinking skills. I've got a few I'm going to share with you today just to kind of whet your appetite to think about where you are in terms of being able to see and spot trends that really matter, what's coming, and then more importantly, what you need to do about it. This first one is called weak signals. And this is actually really interesting. If you like this, you can Google it and kind of read a little bit more about it. But weak signals are this ability that you have to be able to sense what's happening in the environment before it becomes obvious. Because weak signals are sort of by definition something that are not easily detected by most people. Weak signals are early trends, innovations, inventions, they're information or phenomena that you could interpret to mean that there is a potential for a strong change. So think to yourself, a weak signal could be an indicator of a strong change. So weak signals, I think, function really cool because they give you a heads up. They help you begin to see something before most people do, which I think that's a great skill to have as a leader. It's like, how do I see what other people can't see? And then really leverage and act on that information to help me make better decisions. So how do you spot weak signals? This is, of course, the first question I had. Well, that's cool, but like, where are these things? Like, how do I get my radar up to be able to see what a weak signal is? I've got on the screen here a list for you of some ideas of places to look. And what this means is for you to begin getting good at sort of monitoring the environment around you and looking in interesting and different places to spot these types of trends. So blogs and podcasts are kind of an obvious one. Fringe thinkers, who in your industry do you think kind of pushes the envelope a little bit? I like to think of these people also as futurists, people who actually make their living predicting the future, thinking ahead about the future. You may remember one of the earlier classes, I suggested a book to you called The New Leadership Literacies. Do you remember that? Written by Bob Johansen. He's a futurist. So people like this, they spend a lot of time really trying to understand what might be changing and to predict future trends. Obviously, passionate advocates or activists are people who are usually on the very front end of driving change in our society and in our culture. Art and graffiti is a really cool place to look for things that are happening. Social media, hashtags and memes are kind of an obvious one to begin to look to see where is the conversation shifting. I thought it might be useful if I give you an example of a weak signal and how it could be a predictor of a strong change. And again, once you sort of learn how to use this skill, you can apply it to anything that you're working on. So a good example of a weak signal would be the fact that everybody has been quarantined in their house for several months. And you began to see people kind of settle in around their home, and began to, think to myself, oh my goodness, like my walls need to be changed and my backyard looks like a mess. And so the prediction there is, as people spend more time at home, could they be wanting to invest more time and money to what I call feather your nest, kind of improve your surroundings, like plant a garden or paint your house or set up a nicer home office rather than your kitchen table. So that's a good example of a weak signal that could be an indicator of a strong change, because of course that's going to impact home office furnishings and people who buy gardening equipment, that sort of thing. Another good example of a weak signal that could indicate a strong change is blue skies. This is what I call the weak signal. Blue skies is the fact that everybody was staying at home. They weren't driving their car to work. And all of a sudden, in literally cities all over the world, the skies cleared. And what used to have been maybe a smoggy type of environment became very crystal clear. And I think that could be an indicator of a strong change that could accelerate sort of the green city movement. Like, how do we drive more electric cars, and what might be incentives that our local governments would do for us? How might people ride bikes and want to buy bicycles instead of driving to work? So again, just indicators of, if I see this trend happening, what could that indicate for an industry or a client that we might have working in that space? So that's an idea of how weak signals work to indicate potential for strong change. The next skill I wanted to tell you about is something called sense making. And again, this is an actual skill. This is something that you can learn to do. You can Google it. There's a lot of research that's been done about sense making. In fact, some people say it is a hallmark of an effective leader. So sense making is basically making sense of what is going on around you. So in moments like this, when we all are sort of scratching our heads saying, I have no idea what's happening around me, as a leader, you want to be able to figure that out. You want to be able to take a pretty good look at the environment and know how to make sense of it so that you can make good business decisions. A couple of ways you do this is really drawing on business acumen that I know that you already have, your business skills, such as how good am I at gathering and analyzing data? Where am I getting my data? Am I getting both qualitative as well as quantitative data? Do I know how to interpret that data, draw some valuable insights that I could apply to the work that I have? Am I good at monitoring, which this is sort of a timeless leadership skill, which is I do take the time to invest in looking around me, reading good different types of publications, and hearing what other people have to say, which we'll talk about in a minute on how we get diverse perspectives, but really monitoring the current trends that are happening in the business environment and also really on a global stage. The third one is being open-minded, which is this idea of how do I make sure that I'm not constantly falling into my own patterns and making sort of snap decisions when I should be thinking more broadly and considering new ways of doing things, not digging my heels in and just trying to do things the way that they've always been done, but being willing to consider new change, being this what I think is being agile as a leader. Zeitgeist leadership, there's actually that phrase, for those of us who are German speakers would know that Zeitgeist is the mood of the times or the mood of the moment, which is what's really going on in society around me. Do I kind of have my finger on the pulse of how culture is changing? Some good examples would be the Me Too movement, or certainly race relations that was really sparked here in the US, but I think has become pretty much of a global movement. How people are changing their minds about thinking about these types of topics. And there's actually a good Harvard Business Review article called Zeitgeist Leadership that you can download and read. It's a very good read. Because the idea is, how do I begin to recognize the difference between when something is just a fad, like it's just going to come and go, would not really make a big difference to business and society, and when something's really getting traction, and I need to be paying more attention, and I need to look at changing the way that things are done within my organization or on my team. And then the last part of this is being decisive, which of course we've talked about that before in Gravitas, which is how good am I at being able to take a stand and make maybe courageous decisions about something that I believe needs to be done and moving things forward. So this leads me to this particular thought. You may have heard this quote before. It's a famous Michael Jordan quote, the basketball player, which is, don't be afraid to fail, be afraid not to try. And I had that as a paperweight that I kept on my desk for many years to remind myself, because I was really afraid of failure. That was probably my biggest fear as a leader, was public failure. Oh, I was going to do something and it wouldn't work. People would think I wasn't smart or wasn't capable of being a leader. And I used to tell myself, that's so not true. First, people are not really thinking about me, they're thinking about themselves. But second of all, I think people expect you to try new things and to take some risk, because if you're playing it too safe, you're missing out on a lot of really great possibilities. And to me, this is kind of embracing this idea of, I'm a leader, how can I create what I call this culture of try? That was how I always thought of it in my agency, was how do I empower my people to want to try new things, knowing that something might not work, Like, how do I remove some of those barriers? And so I used to tell myself, teach your people that, hey, the business we are running is a little bit like a greenhouse. We're going to plant some things and they're going to die on the vine. They're not going to work. And then there's other things that we're going to plant and they're going to really blossom and grow. And they may become a real game changer for us. And of course, the challenge there as a leader is you have to be willing to let some things not work. How do you not punish your people when they try something and it doesn't really work? So there's a couple of sort of principles of creating a culture of try on your team that might be useful for you to think about, which is if you want to empower your employees to think in new ways, then I call it the no punishment, no embarrassment rule, which is I'm not going to call you out in a meeting and say, okay, why did your project fail? What went wrong? Shouldn't you have known this or that? Which, we know not to talk like that, but sometimes it's tempting to say, why didn't this work? That's a punishment or an embarrassment to somebody, which will tell everybody else in the room, don't try anything, because if it doesn't work, you're going to be called out in a way that could be very hurtful for you. So you can't do that. You have to be able to help people learn from their mistakes and build on those learnings, but know that that's part of how we win, is we have to attempt different types of things and learn as we go. Not everything is going to be perfect coming right out of the gate. And then stay close to customers. You all know that. That's how we can adapt to win, especially in a time like this. We can't afford to be too hierarchical about how we sense that things are changing in order for us to be effective in moving forward with new ideas. And then the last thought I'm going to leave with you, and then Janet, I'm going to turn it over to you. The last thought I want to leave with you is to think about, if you want to create a culture of try on your team, how do you sort of write your beliefs, if you will, kind of like have your ground rules on, this is a team that believes in trying, and we live that way because we believe that, and here's just some examples, anything is possible. We want to be explorers. We want to have the courage to go new places and try new things. We're willing to let go of perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect to go out the door. It just has to be good enough for us to test it in the marketplace and see what works. And we're lifelong learners. So this is just an example of some ways that you can kind of create some principles and beliefs with your team that would empower them to be much more willing to try and not be afraid of the failure. So with that, I'm going to stop. Janet, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it over to you. You are still on mute.
Okay, did I make the full screen activate?
Yes, you did. It looks great, Janet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. Thanks, guys. All right. Well, thanks, Elise. I appreciate that. So, pardon this kind of a basic, simplistic diagram, but my point here is that we don't always have the complete information we need before we make a decision. Sometimes we just have a little information, but we still have a successful outcome. In other cases, you have tons of research and data available, but the outcome is not so successful. I'm sure we've all been in either one of those kind of scenarios. But in any of those cases, ultimately, you're depending on your own judgment to make the best choice. You increase the odds of making the right decision if you avoid stereotypes, outmoded thinking, and other faulty beliefs about the way things work or the way things, this is my favorite, are really done around here. Decisions are not based solely on your knowledge of the work that you do or even the organization that you work at. They draw from a broad range of resources that we all have access to. You can cultivate a healthy dose of curiosity, which we've talked a lot about in this class, humility, as Elise just mentioned, a willingness to take risks, and a well-honed ability to synthesize all of this disparate information that you're receiving every day, every minute, probably every second, and relate them accurately to the problem at hand. So the most extreme example I can come up with of someone who is truly a leader and who has, took tons of disparate pieces of information and had a successful outcome was Captain Chelsea Sully Sullenberg. He was the heroic airline pilot who famously guided landing a plane on the Hudson River. We call this today the Miracle on the Hudson. Minutes after takeoff, as many of you know this story, but just as a reminder, his aircraft was disabled when a flock of birds, came into the fuselage and struck both of the jet engines. It was like the Newsweek, story. It was on every news channel, right? This was a massive news cycle back in 2015. But when Sully was asked, like, "Hey, Captain, how in the heck did you do this?" He said, "I had to look past, why is this happening? I didn't have, quote, I didn't have time to waste on the what happened phase. It was more important to think about what the options were in the moment." And at that point, there were two airports that were somewhat close, and he thought of the Hudson River. This didn't even come from air control, but he knew that those two airports were probably too far away. He didn't have enough gas or opportunity to land the plane, and that it was the Hudson. And if you think about it, it's important to note that he did have 42 years of flying experience. Not everybody has access to 42 years of work experience. And also, though, that he had never trained, it was never in the training manual to land a plane of this size on the water. But it was his expertise that allowed him the confidence that he needed to make this unprecedented landing. All the passengers survived. And in fact, when the plane landed, and right here in this shot, Sully is also very famous for going back into the plane. He said, after going through everything that we just went through, I am not going to risk not leaving someone behind. So he actually went back into the plane and double checked the entire plane. Talk about an amazing leader and an example of how effective decision making really can work in the workplace. And for Captain Sully, he was at work just like all of you are. He just happened to be in a situation where he was able to save hundreds of lives. And so if you think about not just him, but any leaders, and in fact, when Elise and I debrief a 360, which is essentially having all of your peers evaluate you as a leader, as a performer, so to speak, at work, three main areas come up. Leaders that have foresight, the ability to think ahead, that have agility, meaning to be able to move quickly or change their decisions, and then also kind of focusing that with the decision and how that will impact the long-term planning. Most important is, and I think this is what Elise was really articulating so well, is taking action. I know from my years of coaching experience and just being a leader myself, it can be very, very disheartening to work with a leader who that I call is a can kicker. They don't make decisions, and then when they do, oftentimes they're kind of looking to associate blame and not accept that responsibility. So it's this combination that we are looking for amazing leaders: foresight, agility, long-term planning, and ultimately taking action. I love this quote from Warren Buffett, because he says the hardest thing about making decisions is first truly understanding your priorities. And in today's workplace environment, we have so many priorities. And for those of you that we're doing individual coaching, or we're looking at your SIs, you really are trying to take on a lot. And so if you were to think about right now, just grab a piece of paper, could you get your priorities down from a list that might look like this? Everything from cutting costs to succession planning, perhaps, to finding your replacement, to attracting new clients or top talent, building a diverse team. Yes, these are all important, but are they truly your priorities? And I would argue, the human brain can handle somewhere between 3 and 5. Even if you are the best leader, if you are Warren Buffett himself, he would tell you it's somewhere between 3 and 5, the sweet spot probably being 4. And so I ask you, before you even get into these decision makings and contemplating your SI, what are your true priorities as a leader? So kind of shifting gears, assuming that you understand your priorities and you're thinking about the multitude of decisions that we make on any given day. Sometimes it's, choice A or choice B. And oftentimes that's kind of beneficial. Although this can also be difficult if you have a ton of choices or decisions that were presented, you've done equal amounts of research, and you have two viable options. That can kind of create probably some stress and anxiety. But if you have multiple, let's say you've done all that research and you come up with 6 or 7 viable options, now the rubber's hitting the road. People are looking at you saying, what should we do? And oftentimes what happens with leaders is it kind of becomes way more options than even the 6 or the 7. It kind of, I don't know, for those of you that have seen the movie Monsters Inc., with all the doors coming down that assembly line of all the different options and prioritization setting. And it can be very overwhelming. And what I really want us to do today is kind of settle in, think about your SI, primarily as I am going through this training, and what it is that you need to accomplish, and the decisions, and maybe even as I'm covering some of the pitfalls about bias, etc., around decisions. Think about how that could, in this case, maybe negatively or positively impact your SI. And that'll, headline for you, that'll be part of our breakout today. So because of that, and I just showed you the multitude of decisions and the multitude of doors we can go through, particularly when you're a leader with autonomy to make a lot of these decisions independently, what happens is, and this is a real thing, is this phenomenon called decision fatigue. And it really is difficult to battle. And as we've all been going through COVID, in particularly March and April, when it was the rush to move home and we were making probably hundreds of decisions in a week about how we were going to lead our teams. When are we going to do our stand-ups? What's going to be the touch baits? How are we going to get, the scrum together? I mean, all of these things, about the decisions. And in May and April, many of us were feeling probably pretty tired from that. And so your goal is to try to simplify those choices, even though they're complex, to try to get to the 2 doors, option 1 or option 2, and really being clear with your priorities, and what are the decisions that you must make, and that are important to make, and what are the decisions that could be possibly delayed. And you want to focus on like the momentum that you're gaining when you're making decisions, not like the willpower. I call this like the grit, not quit. That will get you through that kind of mentality. I just have to get through this week. I just have to get through next week. But what happens when you can no longer get through next week, or when you really do hit that proverbial burnout wall from making all of those decisions? So you need to be really careful and mindful of decision fatigue, because what happens with decision fatigue is that we have a tendency to make incorrect or bad decisions because we've just made so many decisions. So frequent breaks, and then when you come back from break, even if it's an hour break during the day, shelf that decision for 60 minutes, take a break, come back, double check your thinking. Yes, this decision still makes sense. So you really want to try to avoid decision fatigue. Some of the other pitfalls, for those of you that are from Michigan, and we have a very famous card game here called Euchre. And when you have a brilliant hand, you get really excited. Your hands are shaking. I know my heart beats. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have it's an unbeatable hand. You tell your partner, I'm going it alone. The partner puts their cards down and they just say, okay, Janet, go for it. But the challenge is sometimes we have a tendency to go it alone when we're making decisions, particularly if it's something we're passionate. You've got this, your hands are shaking, your heart is beating, you feel like this is it, this is the right decision. Sometimes going it alone can have, and in the game of Euchre, catastrophic costs, right? You don't get 4 points, you only get 1, and you may lose the game, right? So we just really encourage you to slow down a little bit and try to avoid going it alone, especially on the decisions that are really important decisions. Many of us, those of you that are in technology, or have a certain personality profile that really love to pour over reams of data, can get locked up in analysis paralysis. I have worked for companies and for clients where literally decisions have been out there for 1-2 years. Just the inability to make the decision and stand by the result, win, lose, or draw. But that analysis paralysis is very disheartening for people that have to work in that environment, because decisions just kind of sit there in limbo, in my opinion, for far too long. A lot of times we have a tendency to value more complicated, intricate solutions, the perfect ones, over the ones that are just elegant and good and easy. Sometimes making a simple decision or making something simpler is better. It's not always the 5-page document with all the steps in the process, that is the right decision. And so, and when you have maybe two people bringing you, two different solutions, potential solutions to a problem, a lot of times, in the human neuroscience shows that the brain actually likes the more complicated. It gives us safety, like, oh, look at all this documentation, look at all this research we did. But we have a tendency to ignore the real simple solution that's right over here in front of us. And like the number one pitfall, I believe, for decision making or what ultimately results in a poor decision making skills is succumbing to your own biases and the biases of others. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit on like where that information comes from. So, this is a great quadrant. And as you are thinking about your SI and where you are getting information from, I want you to think about whether or not that information is opinion based. And sometimes it's fluid, meaning that, it's someone's opinion and the stability of that information may change. You could, if you're having a difficult time making this work for your SI, you could think about this. I did some consulting work for a mid-sized company that was considering going to like unlimited paid time off. Just we don't want to have to track paid time off when people are in or out of the office. So the information reliability at that time was coming mostly from employees. And what do you think what was the skin in the game for the employees around this issue? Would be like, yes please, we would love unlimited time off. Very opinion based at this stage. And also the information stability at this point was a little bit fluid, meaning that they hadn't done a lot of research or analysis of the current paid time off policy to really analyze it, and to have that information be completely stable. So what they decided to do was bring in an outside consultant that could help them evaluate this problem. That was movement and an action. If we are lucky enough where the information is pretty much strictly the facts, and that the information that's being presented to us is pretty stable. So for right now, I would argue during COVID, I don't think anything is fixed in this environment from a business standpoint. It would be very difficult to say, yep, final decision, move on. A lot of decisions are, we'll do this for 60 days or 30 days, and then we will reevaluate. That is definitely not this upper right quadrant. Really, where most decision making sits is kind of what I call like on the fringe, on the opposite ends of this matrix, which is, when you have all facts, but the information is still somewhat fluid, you can decide on boundaries and maybe eliminate options, but recognize our plan is going to probably have to change. Even though today we know this is what COVID is, this is what the laws are in our state, and this is, it's hard because the information stability may change as more test results become publicly available. And then if it's absolutely fixed, meaning the information is super stable, but you've got a lot of opinions coming at you. So if I was that business making the decision on the unlimited paid time off, I would say, okay, all the research is done. This is how much time people took off. This is what this policy would cost. But I'm still getting a lot of opinions from people, right? I may decide on some direction, but we may have to do a little bit more research, right? So that might also be kind of a trial error area. Sorry. So this is kind of what I call like the information matrix when you're making decisions. And I want you to think about your SI. Where are all of the inputs coming from, and where might be some biases that you may trip up on, or potentially have a pitfall on, if you're making decisions based on that information. So really think about that, if you can, for a moment. And when we get in the breakouts, we'll talk about it a little bit. I'll drop a JPEG of this slide into the Dropbox, so you can kind of use this and refer back to this as you are working on other strategic plans and execution of ideas and concepts in your job in the future. So, what is decision-making bias? Well, it's pretty simple, really. It's like, here's what the facts say, and everything is kind of inside of that loop. And that's all the facts. Then you have kind of like what you believe. So maybe what I believe is, I don't really trust employees. I don't think they're going to really work when they say that they are working, and how will we know? But the facts maybe say some things that are a little bit different than what I believe. But unfortunately, it's this little piece of overlap is kind of what we have a tendency to overvalue that information. It's like very common and normal to say, well, I believe this. I found some evidence to prove it, so therefore it must be correct, right? That's decision-making bias. And I love this clip. I use this in every one of my seminars when I'm talking about decision-making. The man is saying, well, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. It's time to do my own research and validate the real truth. Second screenshot is literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe. And the guy is like, jackpot, I know exactly what I need to do. You could see where this could get you into a lot of trouble. And although this is kind of, I'm saying this in jest, I actually have seen many times decisions, big, important decisions for companies kind of being made at the C-suite level based on this. And be very, very careful and mindful when you are doing your own research that you're looking at a multitude of resources. We could also say our political environment is just geared right to this, right? For those that are kind of squarely sitting in those camps of, whatever, left or right, Republican, Democrat. So how do we overcome this decision-making bias? I really love the idea of almost assigning, and you probably have this person on your team, for those of you that have direct reports, who is your chief contrarian? So you say the sky is blue, and then someone on your team says, well, actually, Janet, the sky is kind of, white, and it's the reflection of the rays. And a lot of times we have a tendency to culturally say, oh, that person's a naysayer. They're a negative Nancy. I don't want them on my team. What if you embraced that person and said, wow, you know what? I really rely on you to help broaden my thinking and to make sure that we're making the right decisions. Just think about that. What would that look like? I know that chief contrarian can be sometimes frustrating, but they really do serve a role and a purpose on the team when you're making critical decisions. Obviously, seeking a diverse outside opinion to counter any overconfidence or exuberance that you might be showing for a decision can help validate that thinking, so it's not just your decision. And then, rewarding the process, just like Elise said, if somebody followed the process, they did the research, they wrote the plan, they made the presentation to you, and yes, maybe the outcome wasn't so good, think about rewarding the process that person went through instead of, slapping them around proverbially for making, for having a bad outcome. But if they follow the process, begin in your company and in your team to reward the process. Another great way is to just reframe that problem. Just flip it right on its head. I want to do unlimited PTO. Well, what if that became something much greater at looking at maybe the whole benefits process, or maybe there's something cultural happening in the organization. Sometimes we think we're solving for one problem and we uncover 4 or 5 more. That's good leadership. And also good leadership in prioritizing which is the real problem. And that's kind of like where Captain Sullenberger was able to use his experience and followed his heart and his mind to come up with the right solution. So trust yourself that you do know and you do have the experience. And if you don't, then seek some of that outside opinion. And then, of course, consultants, of course, I'm a huge fan of, because we are one, but a team of colleagues or peers, never underestimate the people that you work with or people that work at non-competing companies that also have similar experience than you, can be a huge valuable resource to make sure that you're making that right decision. Some of you, and hopefully a few of you are, and I know this sounds weird, you may be looking at your SI going, gosh, I'm not sure this is the right SI. And that's why we were having you socialize and talk about it, because this is part of the process. It's like, this is leadership. I'm going to give you kind of a bonus today on a group exercise that I love to do. I've been doing this for years on my own teams, but as a consultant, I just facilitated a planning session for the second half of the year with a team. The leader went on Amazon and bought not hats, they used colored bandanas. And I'm going to take you through what this would look like. Okay, so this person shipped, it was a global team, a green bandana to Susie in India, and John in North Dakota wore a black bandana, etc. And I'm going to have you kind of think about your team in these 6 different colors, hats, t-shirts, whatever. What would that look like? So each person represents, one area of the, I'll call it like holographic thinking for decision making. And those areas are creativity, the critic, the process, the optimist, the informant, and the person who has the emotion. And the reality is most of the time, if you're not seeking outside counsel, you, the leader, are trying to do or be all 6 of these things or people at the same time. Good luck. It's almost impossible. I will say it for myself. I'm kind of an emotional optimist, okay? That is not always the right person to solve every problem. So now I have to make a conscious effort to bring in the process person, the informant who can help me with the research, or maybe the critic who can be that chief contrarian part of the group before making a decision. So in the handout today, I am giving you in Dropbox kind of a grid of what all of these roles are. So one person becomes the green hat. They are not non-judge. Oh, and I realize I'm missing a hyphen and I have an error there in non-judgmental. They are not, and I'm judging myself because I have a typo. They are non-judgmental. They're all about new hope, ideas, and their job is to kind of counter the black hat who is serving as the critic. They are really all about judgment and pushback. They're about the caution, the pessimist, the risk, the danger, kind of looking at this problem through a negative lens. The blue hat usually is the facilitator. It's not always you. The leader does not always wear the blue hat. This is the person who's kind of the manager and the organizer of the meeting, writing a very tight problem statement that you're coming to this exercise to solve, and they make sure that all the hats are heard. Yellow is all about positive. They are the opposite of the black hat. They're like, absolutely. They say a lot of, instead of yes, but, or they say yes, and we could try this, and being kind of looking at the problem as more of an opportunity, I would say. The informant is coming to that meeting with data, analysis. They're the fact finder. They're very objective. They're not letting emotion get in the way or thinking about positive or negative. It's just the facts, ma'am. And then the final hat wearer is the emotional thinker. So all about the feelings, the passion, usually very people focused. So when you're making a decision, they're going to be thinking about the client, the customer, the team that would be most impacted, using a lot of intuition and gut reactions to make those decisions on the fly. But, so you could say, I'm going to practice, I want to be all 6 of those hats. And you can run your problem statement, run your SI through all 6 of these hats and see if it still makes sense, or bring together a group of you with 6 of your peers and spend 45 minutes wearing the hats, so to speak. You'll be surprised what comes out in that meeting. And it can also be a little bit of a fun or an icebreaker or a warm up if you want to use it for that as well. So I've included that today in the Dropbox for all of you. So, I love this quote, and I'm going to wrap here and we'll go to breakout. But, in any moment of decision, the best you can do is the right thing, obviously. But the next best thing, is the wrong thing. The worst thing you can do is do nothing at all. So really encourage you to, be decisive, take action, stand by what you decide, but make sure that you're cautious about all of the pitfalls that could come along the way. So let's go to breakouts, Katie.